Good midday, everyone. Welcome back if you joined a session earlier this morning, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for plenary session number 3. The League of Women Voters of Illinois is thrilled to have everyone here for Issues Briefing 2022. My name is Allison Hout, and it is my honor to serve as the president of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. This entire week of Issues Briefing, we have an assembly of experts to help us acquire the information, develop understandings, and discern the critical needs we need to act on issues. We are here to decide what matters most to us and to become advocates for change. And then we can take that power of our knowledge and understanding back to our communities to engage and activate others. Civic engagement is critical because with engagement comes more voting. We must be sure that we use these many opportunities to have our voices heard in our country. Before we begin, just a few reminders. Our meeting today is being recorded. The subtitles have been activated and if you would like to activate them or enlarge them or end the subtitles, go to the bar at the bottom of your screen, the live transcript option. Toward the end of the session, we will have a question and answer period. During the session, you can put your questions directly into the chat, and you can put them in as a direct message to Question Asker. League members will pose the questions to the speakers at the end of the presentation. I'd also like to remind you that all of the materials that our speakers have shared with us thus far are on our website, LWVIL.org. So please visit the website to see any materials and the resources that the speakers have given us. The references that were made in just the session that we just finished are already posted on our website. So please visit the website, LWVIL.org, for any information that the speakers have shared. I'd like to welcome our sign language interpreters today, Vera Marie Baldoza and Molly Burke. And finally, thank you to our LWVIL Board of Directors, our LWVIL Issues and Advocacy Committee, chaired by Rosemary Heilman and Jean Pierce, and to everyone who has been a part of helping bring together this fantastic week of education and activation. So now let's get activated. Jean Pierce, co-chair of Issues and Advocacy, will introduce our speakers.
All right, Jean, maybe I shall do the introducing because you're on mute there. Yeah, did you go ahead and say what you were going to say?
I'm sorry. Yeah, welcome everybody to our third session of the Issues and Advocacy Issues Briefing for 2022. We'll be looking at ways to minimize disruptions at public events. Our speakers this afternoon are Officer Amy Cholewa from the Buffalo Grove Police Department and Shannon Hiller from Bridging Divides Initiatives of Princeton University. Officer Cholewa will begin, and she does have a sick son, so she will be taking questions immediately after her presentation.
Okay, thank you. I didn't get that message, so let me find, I think it's Cholewa, if I'm not mistaken. Trying to find her here in the picture so I can let me get her participants so I can make her spotlighted. And welcome, Amy. It's so nice that you would give us some time today. I'm sorry about your son. So we'll reverse our plan and I'll let you get started. Amy is from my town, which is Buffalo Grove, Illinois. And the reason we're doing this workshop is we have heard back from some of our members that they have had or are worried about having disruptions at their public events when we go back to in-person meetings, given what they've seen on the news and some experiences they've had even at farmers markets or, you know, ordinary conversations and in addition to upcoming candidate forums and public talks on issues in the news. So Amy's going to give us a few hints that she thinks will be useful for us. So thank you, Amy, and I'll let you unmute and get started.
Great, thank you. First of all, thank you all. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so glad that this is going on, this conversation. I do apologize. My son is running a pretty high fever, and I think whatever he has, I have gotten as well. So I'm also not feeling 100%. But I wouldn't miss this opportunity to speak to such a wonderful group like you guys, and such a relevant and important topic. So how to anticipate and minimize disruptions at public events. I think in this day and age, we all just need to have more patience and more grace. Seems with the events that have happened over the past few years, people are just more agitated, and they go from 0 to 60, if you will. And I think everyone just wants to be heard. And it's important that we give people time and space, and plan accordingly for having public events to anticipate these things. So when you're having a gathering, I know the virtual platform we've all kind of become used to, and it's kind of nice and easy. If we were in person today, I probably wouldn't have come because I'm sick and I don't want to get everyone sick. So this works out, and also just the features of, you can mute people and all that. But now we're going back to a world that we were formerly, and we're going to be meeting in person, and there's so many hot button issues these days, and whether it be about the pandemic or issues related to it, vaccinations, mask wearing, schools, anything. People have a lot to say, and we all have varying opinions. So we need to be respectful of that. When we know that we're going to be meeting in person, I would advise be very important to know your topic, to stay on topic, possibly having a moderator and plan questions. Definitely put out your expectations to the group beforehand, and reiterate it as the event kicks off, if you will. Know of potential disruptions that may come about, and depending on the topic, if you know that there is opposing views, like for example, like the school masking issue, you know that there's going to be people who are one side or the other. You need to be prepared for comments or concerns or disruptions that might be involved with opposing groups. Try and monitor social media and see if there are different groups that are going to be attending, possibly reach out to their leaders or people involved in it, and define your expectations and see if there's anything that they would like to input, things like that. Just kind of making people feel heard, and that you know that they'll be there, and it's not about pushing one side or the other, and that everyone will have a platform to speak at. If there are disruptions during the event, to stay positive, to stay calm. That's something I've learned as a police officer as well. Sometimes you're handling a call or a situation, and there are certainly things that might drive up the energy or kind of push a button, but you need to be prepared and calm in the event that those things happen, and not let people see that it is a disruption. Enforcing the rules if need be. So if there is a disruption or things kind of get sidetracked, to redirect, to give warning. If it's an individual causing disruption, removing them, or if it's a group, maybe even calling for a recess, a brief break. And if safety is a concern, because safety should be the number one priority, and if the safety of anybody at the meetings is in question, then maybe the meeting should be called for a recess, or even canceled or postponed for a later date. So we want to make sure that we maintain the peace and protect people's rights. Goes along with the First Amendment. The First Amendment does not protect against incitement, which speech is intended and likely to cause imminent law breaking. It does not allow for true threats directed at a particular person who would reasonably perceive in the message of danger or violence. And it does not allow for fighting words directed at a particular person or individual face-to-face, which might provoke an ordinary reasonable person to violence. So those things are important to remember. And with that, I would just say preparation is important. Like I said, monitoring social media and knowing what possible groups might be attending. This is very vague. If you know your topic, obviously you'll know what groups to maybe seek out and look for and make contact with them.
Are you ready for a couple questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I have one. If a person is at your meeting, where do you draw the line between fighting words and someone who's just obnoxious and won't sit down? And how much can you do? Like, when do you really need to call the police, and does that escalate things? What could a person do in a meeting? You mentioned a couple of things to redirect them, maybe call for a little break. When should the police be called? When shouldn't they?
So I think it's important to know what your if your topic is something that is very like a hot button issue, I would definitely reach out to the local law enforcement before the meeting occurs as it's being planned, so that we do know that it's going on, and to be ready or available, so that way we can be better prepared for it as well. So that all goes into the preparation stage. And then at the meeting, I would just, depending on how relevant the topic is at that time, to seek out the groups the opposing groups, to know if they're going to be present at the meeting. Fighting words, I would say, are more like threats. As their language escalates, things like that, you want to give warning. At any time that there's a fear of safety of others, absolutely calling in law enforcement, giving them warning. Law enforcement can give them the warning that they need to recognize their behavior and conduct themselves differently, or they'll be asked to leave. Those type of things. Obviously, you might get somebody who just wants to be heard, and they might do so in a way where they are louder or might talk over people. And if, as the moderator, whoever's conducting the meeting, could just let them feel heard, maybe just remind them that they don't need to yell. Everyone's listening, they're getting their allotted amount of time. That might be another thing to consider, giving people a certain amount of time. But anytime that somebody feels threatened, there are threatening words being used, absolutely, by calling the police and having them handle the situation at that point.
Thank you. And now someone told me once that there's a difference if you're having your public meeting in a public space or a private space. So if you were having it, say, at a library auditorium, which would be a public space that anybody could walk into, compared to maybe like a church or something where it's a private location, does that change whether the police can or cannot, or how quickly you could get rid of somebody?
No, if somebody's threatened, if there's imminent danger involved, somebody's advancing on a group, or have said words of threat that they're going to hurt somebody, the police can come in and diffuse that situation. So that wouldn't matter so much. But as far as being open to the public, it could be a private meeting if it's at somebody's house, or a private establishment. But if it's open to the public at a public facility, you might have more varying groups of people that are going to attend.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have some questions before we let Amy take care of her boy and herself? I could sort of see your eyes are starting to.
Thank you for understanding so much.
Starting to take you over. Yeah, do you have any questions over there, Jean?
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, Amy, thank you so much for attending, and I hope you feel so much better soon and that your son is all right. And thank you for everything that the police do to help us make sure that our public presentations are available and safe for the public. So
Thank you.
I will thank you, and I will put a spotlight on Shannon now. Shannon Hiller is the executive director of Bridging Divides from Princeton University. And I will let you tell people about your organization a little bit.
Thanks, and thanks for having me join you here. I likewise have a young son, so I'm so glad that we could give Amy a break to go take care of her family. I will say my son has given me a head cold, so I'll apologize if I'm a little muffled, but I'm happy to cover actually some of the similar areas that Amy mentioned in our work. So as you heard, BDI is a nonpartisan research initiative based at Princeton University. We focus on tracking and mitigating political violence in the US with a specific focus on supporting communities. We started in 2019, in particular, thinking about what communities and decision makers might need ahead of points of conflict around the election. And now, again, are thinking about what that might look like in 2022, 2024, in the next election cycle. But it also means that we think about how you can prepare ahead of those periods of heightened tension, reducing that sort of baseline. And I think that's a lot of what we'll talk about today in terms of other public meetings. I'll add that I come to this work from working in conflict and post-conflict contexts abroad. And I think there's a lot of critical lessons we can bring to apply from successful international interventions and research. But also that means I have a real sense of humility about applying those lessons here in the US and really understanding that folks like you often are the ones who face these challenges and know the reality on the ground and the context best. So we're always trying in BDI's work to focus on that short-term mitigation, but support communities who are really doing that long-term work of healing the divides we face as a nation and maintaining that space for civic discourse. So I'll briefly mention how from that focus on political violence, we came to develop these resources on de-escalation and bystander intervention at public meetings. I think you may have already seen the links in some of the materials, or I know we can drop them into the chat as well. It was actually in response to specific requests from partners of ours around the election process in particular, who were hearing from local volunteers, people even at the county level, that folks were really at a loss of how to engage with this more contentious behavior they were seeing around Board of Elections meetings. But then we were also getting similar requests across different issues, as I'm sure you all have experienced, school boards, boards of health over these past few years in particular. And so while at BDI, we're not experts in de-escalation, we do think a lot about how particular techniques and this work more generally can, one, help keep people safe and reduce tensions after these types of events, if incidents do happen. But two, also really protect civic space, something I know is really important to the League of Women Voters more generally. Having that space to resolve conflicts through the political process is really essential for making progress on these tough issues. So when we got this request kind of wanting more information on de-escalation techniques in particular, we reached out to some of our partners who think about this in their everyday work to create these resources that I see are on the website. The first partner was the Crime and Justice Institute. And like Officer Amy, they're also focused more on the law enforcement side, improving interactions between law enforcement and community. And they led that creation of a law enforcement specific resource I'll talk a bit about. But we also worked with a group called DC Peace Team. And they're a community-led group here in DC that is kind of on the forefront of nonviolent community monitoring. And they created the volunteer resource that you see. And then we also got input from a couple of other groups and individuals across different sectors. One, Nonviolent Peace Force, who focuses on even international methodologies for nonviolent intervention in these types of issues. And then also a consultant who's worked with a variety of different community groups, including de-escalation around the polls in 2020. So I think one of the things we were really excited about in creating these resources is we were able to bring together folks who come to this from so many different perspectives and pull out some of the key principles. And in a sense, folks that may disagree actually on even the role of law enforcement or different ways to approach it, but do agree on these key principles that can help you in your role to prepare. So, how do we keep people safe? How do we protect civic space? Make people feel more empowered to ultimately reduce conflict more broadly in these situations. So before we dive into the specific resources, I thought it might be helpful, and we've talked with folks about how it could be useful to see some of the trends and issues that we do monitor in our work that you might be facing on the ground. Again, at your communities best, and I think you would be able to create a similar list, but can be helpful to understand that these are also ones that we're facing as a nation and are impacting us all in these contexts. The first two, I think, are ones that have been in the news a lot over the past 2 years. And those are the behavior of unlawful paramilitary or armed groups around demonstrations or meetings. And the second is the impact of unfounded claims of election fraud and similar narratives. I know you just heard a lot about that, so I'll cover that one more briefly. The first, when it comes to unlawful paramilitary or armed groups, we saw a lot of activity in response and in backlash, obviously, to the demonstrations around racial justice in 2020. And that heightened level of activity then led into the election, and as we know, to the attacks on January 6th. And so while there was a brief period of deplatforming and lower activity, what we've seen through the past year is that there is still sort of persistent activity in many states that is important to be aware of, including ahead of these meetings. So we work with a lot of different event data, and was seeing even just in March of 2021, there was a Proud Boys event in Illinois that resulted in a specific altercation. But we also think about hate groups in this category. Potentially even in February of this year, our data has a note about an anti-Semitic flyering at the University of Illinois, University of Illinois campus. So just being aware that there are these persistent activities by groups like this that are happening in the communities where you may be hosting events. So the second trend that we watch, and especially going into the election, and I think particularly relevant for your group as you're thinking about preparing candidates forums and others, and a whole other plenary over it. So I'll just say we do monitor kind of the offline activity around the stolen election narrative or other related narratives. For example, the idea of January 6th detainees as political prisoners. And so, for example, in Illinois, seeing that at that same Proud Boys incident, at least our data mentioned that some of the individuals involved were also at the January 6th attack. So seeing how these issues can intersect. And we're certainly expecting those unfounded claims of election fraud to increase going into the midterm season. And so the third trend that I'll mention just broadly before getting into the specifics of de-escalation and the resources is, I think, the one that folks think about around this issue the most. And it's also the hardest one for us to share specific data on nationally, because it's really the intersection of a lot of issues like COVID, anti-CRT, anti-LGBT issues, or around reproductive rights. So as you all, again, know better than I do, these are not new issues per se. They're often things you've been dealing with as challenging topics for a long time. But what we've seen is that then they intersect with a lot of these other issues and can create escalating tension. I mentioned the anti-Semitic flyer at one of the University of Illinois campuses. From our data, at least, it mentioned that it was blaming Jewish people for the pandemic. So you see where COVID has kind of heightened the risk of conflict from some of these other behaviors. And sort of in our monitoring, that's something we're watching. Where is there the co-presence of a lot of these tense issues happening all at once? And how might that be impacting the ability of communities to manage that potential for destructive conflict? So again, getting back to the resources, I mean, I think all these trends, unfortunately, are in many ways headed in the wrong direction nationally. So it's impacting folks at the local level. and the type of behavior that they're seeing at these meetings or public forums. And so we know that this type of contentious or destructive behavior has happened in the past. We know it's likely to happen again. How do we prepare ourselves in our communities to tackle it? So the first thing to note is you saw we created 3 resources, and that's because we think sort of what you can do depends on who you are in the situation. So my sense is that a lot of folks here are thinking about candidate forums or public forums where you yourself are kind of hosting or part of the hosting event. So that's where I'll spend most of my time talking about the elected officials or other officials resource, where you have some formal authority in the situation to structure the event. But we also did prepare that resource by DCP's team for volunteers or folks who are more in a sense a bystander, but who want to be thinking about how they can be constructive in de-escalation. And then, as I said, we had a third resource, a little bit more unique than the others, focused on law enforcement. But in our concept, it wasn't necessarily for law enforcement to use. They get different training, they think about these things in their work. It was more for those first 2 groups to feel more confident in engaging law enforcement on these issues. So could you take this resource if you don't have a pre-existing relationship with law enforcement in your community, and use it as an opportunity to start the conversation? What are their plans for de-escalation around your event? What have they prepared to do if they're called upon? So seeing it as in a sense a resource to engage law enforcement is how we thought about that. And beyond the resources, I would just say, as we were creating these, every single expert we talked to sort of said, well, it's really hard to boil down into 1 page, even though that was a request from community groups. The emphasis is always on how can you plan and prepare and practice this ahead of time. So you'll hear me say this again a couple times, but everyone just said, being able to do some training or run through some scenarios with your group is the ideal. So one of the projects we're working on at BDI is how can we lift up existing trainings and resources in different states? There's some online, there's certainly some in different communities, but I would just say, even though I'll be talking about some general key principles, being able to do a training or run through some scenarios is a great way to approach this topic too. And so, I think the speaker right before me and the one before that already covered a lot of the different dynamics of some of these different resources. So maybe I'll just speak to some of the key principles and re-emphasize some of those same points, and then leave plenty of time for question and answer. If you take a look at that elected officials resource, you'll see that we sort of broke it down into 3 sections. One section was the key principles that really cut across planning, preparing, and responding. And the other 2 sections were trying to think about the types of tools you might need in your personal toolbox, as it were, a de-escalation toolkit. What could you do to de-escalate, but also a safety and security toolkit. So even beyond that, how are you ensuring that you and all the participants are able to remain safe? And so I'll focus on those key principles again, because they cut across and I think resonate with so much of what you've already heard. And I think, yeah, as I said, I've mentioned a couple of times, in order to really sort of solidify your de-escalation or your safety and security toolkit, that's what trainings are for too. So, that sort of practice is what will help you really have that as a core competency. So the key principles that we pulled out to just really emphasize were first, planning ahead to make your job easier in the moment, which you've already heard. Second, emphasizing positive shared values and expectations. And I'll give a couple examples of that. And then third, again, echoing what you've already heard, be prepared to enforce the rules consistently and fairly. And I'll add a little bit on also following up after you might do that in a meeting. So first, in planning ahead, again, you already heard a lot from Officer Amy about these, so I'll go through a bit more quickly. But we also have in the resource that you should be monitoring social media, press, and thinking about anyone or groups who might be coming intending to advance destructive conflict. And here, one thing that we did add based on the many experts that we consulted with, you may also want to consider whether law enforcement or different groups might be the best to be present if you think that there's the potential for conflict in certain topics or certain situations. Law enforcement presence might actually escalate tensions depending on what's being discussed. And so you'll see that we suggest there are ways to think about other community monitors or trusted leaders, and law enforcement can potentially be outside of the venue, or like sort of understanding why you've asked them not to be present at the event itself, depending on the topic. So I think that's something to consider depending on what you hear from the community. And that's kind of across a couple of the points on planning ahead. You'll see we talk about engaging key leaders and community groups, something I expect it comes quite naturally to folks as part of League of Women Voters. And, thinking about which groups might cause conflict and who's a trusted messenger in that group. They might not listen to folks who are organizing the event, but you may know someone who they would listen to. And so how could you engage them ahead of the event and try and create that commitment to have respectful dialogue? I think you could also think about ways to map resources beyond law enforcement and beyond other leaders. So making sure that as organizers of an event, you also know all the different community groups, the sort of responses to different scenarios, as we were discussing, that you have. So what of all the different scenarios you might face, what are the resources you have on hand to respond to them? So thinking about that ahead of time means that it will be easier to reach for them if something does happen. Moving on to the second sort of key principle, we talked about emphasizing positive shared values and expectations. I think this is one that, it sounds like a no-brainer, but I think it's particularly hard to implement sometimes in the current context where people feel they don't share values across a lot of these issues. But I think if you're planning ahead, if you're thinking about ways to do this consistently and constantly in your language and preparation, then it can at least start from a solid baseline. So a technical term that we use sometimes is using in-group language. So trying to constantly talk about how we as a community want to protect space for dialogue can help people to feel like they're invested in that as well, regardless of their position. Echoing what others have mentioned already, posting rules early and repeatedly and clearly so that if you do, or when you do probably have to enforce them, it feels more fair and transparent. And then I think it can also, exactly as you've heard before, how can people feel like they've had their voices heard, similar to other folks who are there? On the third key principle, this starts getting into some of the de-escalation steps a little bit. But as you're enforcing those rules fairly, you also may be creating some potential ill will. People may feel like they've been cut off, but respect it in the moment. So one of the things we added here was that it's important to follow up after any potential conflict or harm. So if you feel like you were able to de-escalate the situation, but folks walked away feeling like they weren't heard or feeling like there was some preferential treatment, how can you purposefully engage after the event itself in a way that de-escalates future conflict? And I think that's particularly important in cases where any group may have felt unsafe by intimidation or other behavior that you were able to take care of, but still may have created that sense of unwelcomeness in the space. So rather than sort of just move on without addressing it, being able to reach out to those communities so that they feel welcome again in future events, we find is really important. So again, wanting to get to questions, maybe I'll just mention a few points from the two toolkit portions of this resource itself. You'll see in the de-escalation toolkit we shared a common mnemonic that seems to cut across a lot of the trainings in de-escalation or bystander intervention, and that's Clara, C-L-A-R-A. Center yourself, listen, acknowledge, affirm, respond, and add. So you can follow some of the links in the resource to get some more depth into why those particular components. I'll just say for myself, I think it was really eye-opening to realize and sort of remember that centering yourself is that first step, so that if you yourself are also feeling rising tension, it's hard to act appropriately on those other steps. And so being conscious and sort of checking in with yourself ahead of any actions is actually really important as that first step in thinking about how to de-escalate and how to intervene in these cases. So I'd encourage you to look more into that methodology. And again, as I said, think about trainings or scenario exercises that help you practice that, practice moving through those steps in Clara. When it comes to the safety and security toolkit, I think you've heard a lot of these points already. I'll actually just highlight the last two in particular. So we had a particular point on familiarizing yourself with state laws on open carry and self-described militias. So as I said, I think this is a trend that has not gone away, even if it's not as prominent as we saw in 2020. And there's a lot of great resources out there that can help you make sure you have the available law and applicable law on hand. And so even though you're not maybe going to be citing the statute in the moment, you'll feel, folks in your organization will feel more confident in how they're speaking about these often sensitive issues. An organization called Georgetown ICAP, you may be familiar with. They created a 50-state resource for on unlawful paramilitaries. And the fact is that they're illegal in all 50 states, but there's different sort of nuance to that. And so it's quite easy to download the one for Illinois from their website. And I'd be glad to share that link too. And then the final point from the safety and security toolkit I'd emphasize is this, the point to debrief after the event and including specifically on the security situation. So this is common for law enforcement or for others, but I think it's important for community groups to consider as well. What worked well, what groups were not sort of abiding by the rules. How did your staff do? What are resources or capacities they might need to succeed next time you have a contentious meeting? Doing that debrief when the meeting is still fresh in your mind can be really helpful for future planning. And it may be that many of your chapters and groups do that already, but making sure to add in that security component. Did everyone feel safe in this space? What could we do to make sure that all the groups we want to be present do feel safe next time? Are some questions that would be important to add to any sort of debrief like that. So again, I'm actually quite eager for your questions and comments. As I said, we're always very interested and find it useful to hear what types of specific events folks are sharing, because it can help inform our future work and the types of resources we might create, especially going into the election, but even just for everyday events that you all are hosting. So thanks again for having me, and look forward to any questions.
Do you have some, Jean? I have a few.
Well, one that I'm wondering about when you're talking about planning, is there any kind of a do not fly list that can be used to prevent known disruptors from entering a meeting?
Well, I guess it depends on what your goal. There are a couple of comments. One is it depends on your goal of the meeting. So I think if one of your goals is to hold particular public space, it might make it harder to say certain people are completely unwelcome, because part of your goal is to welcome everyone to engage on that issue. At the same time, you heard Officer Amy talking about freedom of speech does not protect threats and other types of behavior. So if someone has repeatedly threatened others or violated the rules that you've posted, I think it is appropriate to say that certain individuals are not welcome because they haven't followed the rules that you've set out for that particular forum. the last thing I'd say is when we talk about monitoring social media and other spaces or engaging with law enforcement about that monitoring, I think it is important to know specific groups that have been known to engage in or advocate violence in the past. And so even if the goal of your sort of forum is to be completely open, and you may not say that you may decide to allow those groups there, you should certainly be aware that they have a history of advocating violence and have a plan to approach if anything they're doing is intimidating others or creating an unsafe space. So I'd put into that category groups like the Proud Boys and others.
Thank you. Another question is, please repeat the Clara acronym and the words it stands for.
Sure, I'd be glad to. I mean, again, I'll repeat it here, but I just encourage you to review the resources, and in the resources you can have a link on to more in-depth explanation of what Clara, how it should be applied. So it stands for center yourself, listen, acknowledge and affirm, respond, and add. So
what is that last one? ADD? Add?
Yeah, this is where my son's head cold he gave me is like making it hard too. So yeah, and that's, it's meant to be, so it's useful in bystander intervention, but I think also in responding to broader scenarios. So when it's referring to acknowledge and affirm, it means to whomever might be upset and escalating the situation, or one or both parties, and then responding to what you've heard as you were listening, and then how you can add, other options. But again, I'd encourage you to look up some of the really useful resources online. And as I told you, I'd be a broken record on this one. Consider taking a de-escalation training or bystander intervention training that would practice going through those steps.
Okay, well, I have a few. Also, someone wanted you to repeat the Georgetown resource, please.
I'd be glad to. It's the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, ICAP, and I'll be glad to share the link. Their director is Mary McCord. You may have heard comment on some of the unlawful paramilitary activity that we saw leading up to the election and still this past year.
Okay, so a couple of, well, I'll read the first one. Sally Rudolph comments, I chaired our county zoning board for 18 years. I think it's very important that the procedures and rules are understood by the public at the beginning of the meeting. Things such as speakers' time limits, etc. Also, now that was an actual governmental body, though, had law enforcement in attendance several times for some contentious wind farm hearings. So I thought that was, you never know what topic is going to get people riled up. But a couple of our other people have a similar, both Janet and Nancy are asking the same thing. Janet says, what to do when an organized group comes in numbers, prevents others from attending, or Nancy says, we see intentional disruption where the goal is to disrupt, not to be heard. So it's not like they need their voice heard. How to respond, they're making noise so people can't be heard, refusing to listen, and so on.
Yeah, that's right. To the wind farm comment, that's exactly right. When I say every local context is different, we have someone on our staff who dealt with city zoning and has faced a lot of challenging meetings in her career, obviously, and we'll be talking to some folks in Connecticut later this week about similar issues. And they said one of the statewide contentious topics they've been facing are changing mascots at local high schools and middle schools. And so I think it could really be any topic, as you say, that's contentious. And so hopefully these skills apply across. I think when it comes to groups coming to intentionally disrupt or shut down a meeting, the first comment I'd add is that Clara acronym does still apply. Sometimes the purpose of disruption can still be engaged with, and sort of listening to the issues that people are bringing, because if they're disrupting as sort of an act of civil disobedience or some other type of action, listening and being willing to acknowledge and engage with the reasons that individuals or groups are disrupting procedures can sometimes find a way to, if not set the meeting itself back on its original agenda, set up space for a later meeting or later engagement that allows more dialogue. I will say though that sometimes groups don't have, their purpose is to intimidate or otherwise create fear around certain issues. And I think it's important to consider whether that's what's happening in those cases as well. And then I think that's where I go back to, one, the importance of keeping others safe. So if you really do feel like the situation is escalating in such a way that there's threats, like potential of physical violence, then to consider what your options are there, whether it's adjourning the meeting, offering other options to engage on the issue after. I think it's important to keep in mind that, especially as folks organizing events in these cases, when there's an organized group that's there to purposely intimidate, that may be the best course of action. I think there's also ways that if you planned ahead, that's why you saw that sort of the top line, you can plan for the potential that those specific groups may come and try and disrupt or take over the meeting. And then you could have a couple of steps that you would move through if that happened. One you saw in the resources, keeping groups separate. So having purposeful different separate areas that may make it possible to engage without someone sort of overwhelming both the space and the topic. You also may have, whether it's law enforcement or other community groups who are already on call to engage with those groups you're worried will take over the event or purposely disrupt. So who do you think might be best placed to interrupt that process, sort of address it in a way that de-escalates, and move on with the agenda and the purpose of the event?
Okay, thank you. Do we have any others? I was going to put in fact, I will put it in the chat, and maybe you can talk about it a little bit, or I did. I attended a bystander training, and maybe you can talk about bystander training. It was offered here by the Chicago branch of Asian American Advancing for Justice in Chicago, and I've put the website in the chat. And Shannon had told me about this. They've basically hired another group, which is named Hollaback, to do this training, and they do quite a few trainings. So this one was specifically geared to what do you do as a bystander if you see someone, particularly, of course, in this case of a certain ethnic group, being harassed. And it had some tips. And what I found interesting, it was free, it was an hour, and I just signed up, and they have lots of times that they're offering. And we were not able to get someone from that group to come today. The timing didn't work out. But evidently, this is something that many different organizations in different corners of our community are looking at for different reasons. And then, wouldn't you know, in my Rotary district newsletter, here I was doing it for this, and the district director said, oh, by the way, to Rotarians, if you're interested in bystander training, and he gave a link to the same training by the Asian Americans for Justice, and other people from from schools and all different walks have been going to this training. So you must be hearing from a lot of groups like ours, Shannon.
A few, and thank you so much for dropping that link in. You're right. I think we see in particular Asian American groups thinking about this training because of the rise in anti-Asian hate around COVID. And so folks feeling unsafe even on the street or in the grocery store, wherever, and wanting, again, to feel like they have some more agency in that situation. And I think it's appropriate for anyone. The training from Holla Back actually originated in bystander intervention for sexual harassment. So knowing that sexual harassment can be quite common on the street, what can you, as someone who sees it, do? What can you practice and be prepared to do when you see that happening? And so I know they've intentionally expanded those trainings to move beyond just sexual harassment and cover other times that you as an individual seeing some situation that you may want to intervene in, how do you approach that? And I think it's certainly, even in my personal life, it's hard to know exactly what to do in that moment because it is tense or the circumstances are always different. So I think these trainings are really useful because they'll walk you through both the process and have you sort of practice what you might do in those situations. And I think you'll see that we have the volunteer resource that was created with DCP's team. The concept there, some people say bystander intervention, sometimes they say upstander intervention, is that as a volunteer at a meeting or in some other concepts, in other contexts, you would use similar techniques and tactics as to bystander intervention. So yeah, I mean, I think one of what we're thinking about as BDI is there's more of these virtual trainings available since COVID, but how can we make it really easy for people to know about in-person trainings in their own state? And so we're working to try and produce a bit of a directory of existing trainings wherever we can find them, hopefully in all 50 states or across several communities. And so, stay tuned for that too. And if you know of any good training like this in your own community, please reach out to us. We'd love to include those groups, however small, in the directory, because I think oftentimes people know they'd like to do more, but it's hard to navigate, where can I go? When can I sign up for this type of training? So certainly the link that Rosemary just dropped in is a great one in Illinois, but we hope to provide even more over the coming months.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Diana. When you think about trends you are seeing and training or resource needs, are you hearing from or about election commissions and any attempts they are making to ensure polling place workers can deal with conflict?
Unfortunately, the short answer is yes, we are hearing of similar trends. But one of the organizations we worked with, actually, and some of the consultants we worked with for these resources had engaged in de-escalation around polling places. So as civic groups preparing to de-escalate with folks in line or outside of places where folks vote. I know that there is a lot of concern about even potential for partisan monitors or others involved in the voting process, whether it's at the registrar, at the polling place, for that to become a contentious situation. And so one of the things we are seeing is that some state secretaries of state are offering additional training to election clerks or registrars or others to have these same sorts of skills. There's also some training, as you saw, one of the things we encourage throughout these resources is being familiar with the types of bad actors you might encounter. People or groups who have shown that they're trying to disrupt the democratic process. How can you be aware of those in your particular state and your community? So I think there's some efforts to provide that additional information to folks who are working at local polling places. So the hope is that, if people are informed, they have a plan, and then they have some skills to address the situations that might arise. As individuals, they'll be more ready for those situations. But, the longer answer, the more complicated answer is that, we really think as Bridging Divides Initiative, we think organizations like the League of Women Voters have a really potentially could have a really positive role to play in that scenario too. Groups that people see as trusted already in the communities, who can start thinking about those scenarios now, and helping to build kind of community commitment to defend the democratic process if there are those who are trying to undermine it. So, I think we have some months before voting in November. So my overarching comment would be that, each of you and your local chapters could even be thinking about how you can support those efforts as well.
Thank you. Mary is asking Jean and I, will the websites mentioned, asking Jean and me, whether the websites mentioned in the chat will be listed on the website. You know what, Mary, I'm going to save the chat and come up with a document with all these lists on one document, and we'll.
You know what? They are going to be on the website. We've got someone putting them up as Shannon is speaking.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, that's terrific. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, that's excellent. Thank you. Let's see. Jean Clara. Don't know if this is a question for LWVIL or the speaker. In many communities, local elected officials have been harassed. Oh, we've been hearing a lot about this, and I foresee them not wanting to serve again. We want everyone to run. What programs can we provide to our local communities to encourage people to be engaged and run for election?
Well, so it sounds like the last part of that question is one for the League of Women Voters about, motivating people to engage in a sense. But one thing we think about a lot as BDI is the first piece of that question. If there's a sense of rising political violence, threats and harassment of officials, does that undermine broader engagement in the democratic process? And I think there is some evidence that folks are resigning because of those threats and harassment, especially around that stolen election narrative, those unfounded claims of fraud. I would point another link for y'all in the chat. I don't have it on me, but many of you may have seen the National League of Cities report on threats and harassment against officials. And they link to our resources, but they also did a survey of their members. And I think when they asked some of them what they're doing about threats and harassment, some of the officials did say they are resigning. They're at the point that's how they're planning to address it. So I think what we think about with a lot of our partners is how can we get a better sense of where this is happening, so that we can help to advocate. And when I say we, I mean sort of everyone can help to advocate for greater resources to address these types of issues where they're happening. I also think in a longer term sense, as I said at the beginning, the ability to protect this space for civic discourse on what are contentious issues is important. I think COVID is a challenging issue. The impact of COVID on communities is a challenging issue. And if we don't find a way to discuss that at all levels, then we'll continue to see this type of conflict. There's no excuse for threats and harassment. And I think there's lots of ways to deal with that, whether it's elevating into law enforcement, thinking about whether it's coming from a specific community group or being incited by someone who's kind of advocating for that type of harassment against public officials, and thinking about how to engage the community and pushing back against those narratives. There's a lot of sort of in the moment ways that you can address that types of threats and harassment. But I think the work of also protecting civic space to engage in constructive conversation around these issues helps to sort of short circuit some of that rising tension as well. So I think it's a yes, and it's all these tools at once that can ultimately affect that sort of persistent threat and harassment that we're seeing.
Here's a follow-up question here. Are there suggestions to include in our forum invitations to assure participants that would make them feel more comfortable and less fearful regarding possible disruptions?
I think it would be important to engage with each of them about what they're concerned about, and ask them what would make them feel more comfortable. That's where we reference, we have seen in some communities that For example, and again, not everywhere, of course, but some candidates may feel like they've been harassed by law enforcement before. So in that case, you may find ways for law enforcement to be present, but not in the room, and make folks feel more comfortable there. And they may also, specific candidates or folks participating usually know who's been causing the most issue around that, like sort of harassing them the most, or the source of some of their concerns. And so talking about that ahead of time, so you can prepare to deal with those individuals showing up or find ways to minimize their impact on the event, I think can go a long way. So it gets back to that very first key principle of planning ahead, but also to the principle of sort of listening and acknowledging the concerns that different participants, even as candidates or others, might have, and preparing for how to address them.
I would, even though the League of Women Voters is open to any gender and anyone 16 and over, I would like you to make a few comments specific to women, especially when they're in a position of authority in a group, or trying to be. There's special concerns or issues.
Yeah, interesting. You know, it's so strange too to be, I think you may have even structured this event going from being all virtual for so long for many folks to being back in person. I think just at the top, at least for myself, I'll even say it takes a minute to realize that you're readjusting to being in person. And so just acknowledging that that's the reality, and thinking about how that might affect your leadership in the moment is important too. Getting back to that centering yourself, you know, checking and understanding where you are in the context. I think it's particularly apt for women who maybe you spent many years getting better at, you know, projecting authority, and now you have to do it not in front of a Zoom screen. It's a new context again. I also think it's those sort of tips about knowing who your allies are in the room and who other trusted voices are. I think for women in particular, sometimes thinking about who can sort of validate your leadership and support your role, if you know that there are certain folks who are less likely to listen to you in enforcing the rules. How can you already have some key allies in the room ready to step in when you might need them, or ready to support and validate your authority in that situation? I find is also quite important. You know, I feel like I'm probably speaking to the experts in this case. I mean, I think folks often learn from their own experience what's most is sort of effective in that situation. But we also hear from our partners that there can be generational divides. And so acknowledging those, not just in who you're bringing into positions of authority in those situations, but to who might be present at the events. To me, that gets back again to who are the trusted messengers to those groups. If you feel like you can't speak to them in the way that will be most effective to engage, who could among your team or at the event. All of which gets back to the purpose of the event. If you're trying to protect that space for civic dialogue, it may mean that you need more of a kind of team leading it and other folks to call on in particular contexts. But otherwise, again, I'd say I'm sure lots of folks on this call have more tips that are specific to women in these situations. So, you know, I know there's all those ones about like power poses before you go on stage, right? So those are probably for a different context.
One of our voter service chairman on the League of Women Voters of Illinois wants everyone to know that they are preparing a document on how to run for office, because the League really wants to encourage everybody to run for office. We don't like elections where there's no opponent, you know, even though it seems easier, it's definitely not the way a democracy should be run. Without sounding like a smart aleck, I tell people, everyone in the world is I say cranky, but really I think stressed and overwhelmed because of COVID and being inside and fear and uncertainty and all this. Do you have some data that this has like what the impact of the pandemic has been on all these topics.
I think to validate that that observation, a lot of the data that we work mostly with though is around demonstrations or kind of offline events. And so COVID-related demonstrations have been consistent since the beginning of the pandemic. In the first year, it was a real mix, people going out to advocate for public health measures to support folks working in hospitals, better pay for health workers and others. And something to be aware of over the last, say, 8-10 months is that COVID-related demonstrations are now overwhelmingly anti-mandate, anti-vaccine, more kind of anti-COVID measures than that mix of for, against, many different components. So we do see in the data that we work with most often that there is that pivot to sort of more anti-mandate and often intersecting with anti-government behavior. And so that's something that I think speaks to people's exhaustion with the pandemic for sure. But we also monitor where it's created fertile ground for recruiting to more extreme ideologies around anti-government behavior, which is another unfortunate feature of the pandemic. So I think it's important to acknowledge where just everyone's exhausted still, especially parents of young children. But that doesn't mean that you can't still call out more extreme ideologies that use COVID as an excuse to advocate for, as you heard even in Chicago, anti-Semitic views, white supremacist views, or others. So to me, that gets at some of those, even those very technical tactics about acknowledging people's concerns about the pandemic, but being firm about the sort of principles and the values that are core to the community that you're working with. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the data we work with mostly, but of course there'll be many studies for many years to come about how we've all been affected by the pandemic. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as well.
You mentioned that BDI has a goal of creating a directory of trainings. What other goals are you working on? What else can we hope to find?
Sure. Well, I have to say that directory is one of the things I'm most excited about because it feels so practical and it's something that people then can carry forward and use in the election and beyond. But more broadly, our work falls into 3 areas. The first is really action-oriented research that we hope can get at that, helping folks be more informed about the issues around political violence that we're facing as a country or in a particular community. So we'll continue to put out customized, but also some broader resources, especially as we head into the midterm and then the 2024 election. We also, in our work, really try and focus on collaboration across different sectors, as we did for these resources on de-escalation. But when we think about the election, we also think about collaborating with folks on that sort of threat and harassment data, or other, we do some support to the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation movement, where folks are thinking in the long term about what it means to engage in racial healing in the US. We think that that actual act of collaborating is so important so that when we do sometimes face these moments of crisis, people already have those relationships and can respond more robustly. And then the sort of last area of our work is focused on trying to think about policies that can really bring to bear a whole of society response to political violence. Certainly what I've experienced in a lot of other countries where I worked is that we often turn to security responses. We, say, let's, bring in law enforcement and the military to deal with these challenges. And that can certainly be one part, especially when we need to keep folks safe in the immediate term. But to get out of these negative cycles, in all of the research and the research that we bring to bear on these issues, it tends to show you need the whole of society response to get ahead and to break out of that cycle. So how can you protect the space for dialogue? How can you help folks start to bridge links across different communities so that they can talk about what it means to move forward together? There are real policies that can tackle that now, even as we're focused on the immediate risk. So I'm glad that you all have dropped our website into the chat, and we'll hopefully be, it's a little bit, it needs a refresh. So hopefully soon you guys will see lots more resources there, especially heading into November.
Do you have concrete examples of role-playing scenarios or of using another group to diffuse a situation in those?
Sure. I mean, Hollaback does some like bystander intervention role playing for sure. We also, I think this is why we're so excited about that that directory and resource, because oftentimes some of the groups that offer these trainings are also the groups that are engaging, whether it's around protests or elsewhere, doing that specific de-escalation. So there were some groups whose one of them was Leaders of Kenosha. So after the events in Kenosha, for example, some different groups formed who were thinking about how do we make sure we can keep people safe around future demonstrations. So I don't know actually if they do specific trainings, but they're also those groups that prepare themselves to be kind of monitors in certain situations too. So our hope is that by creating this directory, we'll also have lots of great examples to answer that question better when we get asked too. So
that's wonderful. Well, I don't have anything else myself. I'm so appreciative for you with your cold and poor Amy with her fever, and that you and the other things that we were able to have you on, Shannon. It's a pleasure and a privilege to meet you. Jean, you want to close us off and remind people what we're going to see the following week?
Absolutely. So I too want to express my appreciation for being with us today, Shannon, and also thank you to our league members and friends of the league for staying informed and engaged. Your voice makes a difference. These resources will be posted on the league website and shared with you. We do encourage you to stick around for a brief poll. I think we've sorted out how to do it. And so then after that, we hope you'll join us at noon on Monday when board members Kathy Kenny and Melissa Lieb will discuss the Illinois Voter Guide. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to stop the